It is the year 1918. The Ottoman Empire has been defeated in the World War, and now Britain controls Palestine. The Balfour Declaration has had a widespread impact, and the first tensions between Arabs and Jews have begun to emerge. However, life for the Palestinians is entering a more difficult stage. In this episode, we will cover the formation of the State of Israel and the beginning of the all-out war between the Arabs and Israel. So stay with us. After the British occupation of Palestine and the withdrawal of the Ottoman Empire, the League of Nations, which existed before the United Nations, appointed Britain as the mandatory power over Palestine. Britain was tasked with preparing the country for independence. However, Britain had already made two contradictory promises. To the Jews, it had pledged to establish a safe homeland for them in Palestine, and to the Arabs, who had been its allies during World War I, it had promised independence. Now the League of Nations also expected Britain to guide Palestine towards self-rule, but none of these promises were fulfilled. In fact, between the First and Second World Wars, Britain's primary goal was to maintain Palestine as a colony while keeping both Jews and Arabs content, a project in which it failed miserably. After World War I, persecution of Jews in Europe not only did not subside, but intensified further. Anti-Semitism was not limited to Germany, and as a result, Jewish immigration to Palestine increased dramatically. They purchased large amounts of land, especially in the northwestern parts of what is now Israel. Cities such as Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Acre became places where Jewish-owned property eventually surpassed that of Arabs. Despite repeated declarations from Arab sheikhs of the region and Britain's attempts to promote coexistence between Arabs and Jews, tensions quickly escalated. Arabs, feeling increasingly threatened, began to rebel. These uprisings were far beyond the small-scale clashes that had occasionally occurred between newly formed Jewish communities and small groups of Arabs during the Ottoman era. Three major uprisings took place in 1920, 1921, and 1929. Initially, these were mostly peaceful strikes organized by Arabs, but they soon turned violent. Britain's efforts to restore peace and promote coexistence between the two sides failed, and it began to restrict Jewish immigration to Palestine as much as possible. On one hand, wealthy Arab landowners who had profited from selling land to Jews favored peace and stability. On the other hand, many rural Arabs felt threatened, opposed Jewish settlement, and demanded that Britain honor its promise of independence. Meanwhile, Jews were frustrated with Britain for failing to protect them and for not keeping its promises. Interestingly, all three groups, Arabs, Jews, and the British, ended up fighting each other with casualties on all sides, including Jews killing British soldiers. Between 1930 and 1936, conditions calmed somewhat thanks to British intervention, but this was merely the calm before the storm. When Hitler rose to power in Germany, a much larger number of Jews fled to Palestine and bought land from Arab landlords, causing even more Palestinian peasants to lose their homes. This time, large groups of Arabs, with support from their leaders, launched an armed revolt against both British forces and the Jewish community. The rebellion, however, backfired. Britain deployed an additional 20,000 troops to Palestine, while the Jews began arming themselves and undergoing military training, forming the Haganah Defense Organization. The Jewish community in Palestine grew stronger, while the Arab community was weakened. More than 5,000 Palestinians were killed, and many others were imprisoned or exiled, whereas British and Jewish casualties were minimal. Later, Britain attempted to ease tensions and even promised the Palestinians independence within 10 years. But a new storm was already on the horizon: World War II and the tragedy of the Holocaust. In 1939, just as World War II began, Britain decided to severely restrict Jewish immigration to Palestine. This decision enraged the Jewish community and triggered widespread clashes between Jewish paramilitary groups and the British authorities across Palestine. These confrontations became so intense that the Arab-Jewish conflict was largely pushed into the background. In 1945, when Germany was defeated in the war, the atrocities committed by the Nazis against the Jews shocked the entire world. These crimes drastically shifted public opinion in Europe and the United States in favor of the Jewish people. Most Jews no longer wished to remain in Europe, and one of their preferred destinations was Palestine. Contrary to what one might expect, even then Britain continued to restrict Jewish immigration. As a result, many Jews began boarding ships illegally and attempting to reach Palestine, something comparable to today's migrations to Europe but on a much larger scale. However, Britain intercepted many of these ships at sea and sent them back to Europe. These actions severely damaged relations between the Jewish underground organizations in Palestine and the British authorities. Jewish groups began carrying out assassinations and acts of sabotage against British targets in Palestine. At the same time, Palestinian Arabs had become divided. One faction continued to oppose Jewish immigration, while a smaller minority believed that Jews should be granted refuge. After World War II, Britain was greatly weakened and losing its colonies. It could no longer control either the Jewish or Arab populations in Palestine. Consequently, Britain began to withdraw from the region and handed over the matter to the United Nations. The United Nations immediately proposed the two-state plan to resolve the Palestine conflict. However, there was a major problem. According to this plan, 55% of Palestine's land was allocated for the establishment of a Jewish state, with the remainder designated for the Arabs, and Jerusalem was to become an international zone. This was despite the fact that the lands Jews had purchased only accounted for roughly 10 to 15% of Palestine. The Jewish community welcomed the plan enthusiastically. The Arabs, however, strongly opposed it. They were unwilling to give up their land and were dissatisfied with the proposed division, a reaction that was entirely justified. In addition, some of the newly established Jewish military organizations of the 1940s had already clashed with Britain and had even committed certain crimes against Arab villagers, which further fueled Arab feelings of insecurity. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the independence of Israel in Tel Aviv. The very next day, 5 Arab countries declared war on Israel. If you want to learn how the newly established Israel managed to confront these Arab countries, be sure to watch the next part. Thank you so much for staying with us throughout this video.